I don't remember much about the day I was taken. Just flashes. I was 9 years old. The smell of damp concrete, the rough hands that pulled me from the park, and the distant sound of my brothers laughing, completely unaware of what was happening. For years, I dreamed of that moment, of screaming louder, of running faster. But at 9, I wasn't fast enough or strong enough. The next thing I knew, I was being shipped off to some distant factory where I worked alongside dozens of other kids, all of us cogs in a machine, dirty and worn. We were little more than ghosts. No names, no future, but that part of my life, the part where I woke up to the sound of machinery and collapsed into bed after hours of labor, ended the day they found me. I thought, after all this time, things would be different. I'd been waiting for my family to find me. The Smiths. Wealthy, powerful, I knew they had the resources to search for me, and even though years had passed, I'd held on to hope. Every single day, when I was finally reunited with them, when I was barely 16 years old, I remember stepping into our mansion, feeling its cold walls and polished floors, expecting warmth. Love. I was their long-lost daughter, after all, but instead, I felt like a stranger. When the doors of the mansion closed behind me, the first thing I noticed was how unfamiliar everything felt. The furniture had changed, new paintings lined the hallways, and there was a certain stillness in the air. I had imagined this moment for so long, dreamed of running into my mother's arms, of my father lifting me up like he used to when I was little. I thought Sam and Jack, my older brothers, would drop everything and rush to hug me, telling me how much they missed me, but none of that happened. My mother, Patricia Smith, stood there in the grand foyer, looking at me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hugged me, yes, but it felt stiff. My father, Richard Smith, gave me a pat on the shoulder, muttering something about how glad he was to have me back. Sam and Jack, 18-year-old twins, were there too, but their faces were hard to read, more curious than happy. They were both taller now, no longer the boys I remembered. Sam, the eldest, had grown into a serious, no-nonsense young man, while Jack, always the joker, barely looked at me before muttering a quick, "Hey." It was Sarah who stood out the most. She was beautiful, with long, silky blonde hair, perfectly curled at the ends, and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. She stood beside my mother, holding her hand as if she had always belonged there. I didn't need anyone to tell me who she was. I had heard whispers of her existence even before I returned, how my parents had adopted a girl from orphanage in my absence 1 year older than me, a girl who had filled the empty space I left behind. "Carol, this is Sarah," my mother said, her voice too cheerful, like she was introducing a guest, not her own daughter. "She's been such a joy to us." Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that made my skin crawl. "It's nice to meet you, Carol," she said softly, her voice honeyed and sweet. "Nice to meet you too," I forced myself to say, even though I already hated her. When I was kidnapped at 9, my disappearance shattered my family in ways I could only understand after coming back. I had expected them to hold on to my memory like a precious relic, but instead, they moved on, almost too quickly. My return revealed how much they had changed in my absence, and how Sarah had filled the void that I left behind. In the years after I was taken, my parents were consumed with grief. Losing me must have felt like losing their sense of control over their lives, their ability to protect their children. They searched relentlessly for me in the beginning, hiring private investigators, appealing to the media, doing everything they could to bring me home. But as the years passed without any trace of me, that hope began to die. And in the midst of their grief, Sarah arrived. Sarah had come into our home 1 year after my disappearance. She was everything they could have wished for in a daughter: beautiful, talented, smart, and obedient. Her charm made it easy for my parents to forget, even if only temporarily, the gaping hole that my absence left in their hearts. She was an escape from their pain, a way to stop dwelling on the haunting question of what had happened to me. For my parents, it must have felt like fate, like a second chance. They couldn't get me back, but they had found another daughter to love. And it wasn't just that she was there when I wasn't, it was that she excelled in everything she did. Sarah was the model child they could show off to the world, the daughter they could rely on to bring them pride and joy. Her perfect grades, her social grace, and her maturity made her everything they needed at a time when they were desperate for something good in their lives. In a way, she healed their wounds. But in doing so, she erased me from my parents. Loving Sarah was easier than dealing with the pain of losing me. Loving her didn't carry the burden of guilt and shame that came with my memory. Whenever they thought of me, they would be forced to remember the failure of not being able to protect me, of not knowing where I was or whether I was safe. Sarah was a clean slate. And the more they lavished her with love, the easier it became to suppress the pain of my absence. It wasn't that they didn't care about me anymore, it was that thinking about me hurt too much. They needed to move forward, and Sarah made that possible. I realized that their favoritism wasn't just about Sarah being perfect, it was about survival. It was how they coped with the trauma of losing their daughter and trying to rebuild their lives. The days that followed were a blur of awkwardness and confusion. I had thought that coming home would be the end of my suffering, but it turned out to be the beginning of something else, something I wasn't prepared for. My parents tried to act like everything was normal, but there was always this distance. They weren't unkind, not really, but they weren't the same either. It was like they didn't know what to do with me anymore. Sarah, on the other hand, fit perfectly into the role of the beloved daughter. She was everything I wasn't: polished, graceful, and smart. She was in her final year of high school and already had her pick of universities. Straight A's, top of her class, and involved in every extracurricular you could think of: debate team, student council, even ballet. My mother doted on her, constantly gushing about Sarah's achievements, while I sat quietly at the dinner table, barely acknowledged. "Isn't Sarah just wonderful?" My mother would say, her voice dripping with pride. "She's been accepted into all the best schools. Harvard, Yale, can you imagine?" I'd nod, forcing a smile as I pushed my food around on my plate. What could I say? It wasn't like I could compete with Sarah. She had years of schooling and a perfect life. I had spent my childhood in a dark, windowless factory, learning nothing but how to sew buttons onto cheap shirts. Sam and Jack weren't much better. They barely spoke to me, as if the sister they had known was gone and I was just a shadow of her. Sam was serious, always focused on his studies at university, and when he did talk to me, it was like he was trying to be polite, but I could tell he didn't care. Jack, who had been my partner in crime when we were kids, treated me like a stranger. He had always been the fun one, always making me laugh, but now he was distant, cold. My brothers, Jack and Sam, had been young when I was kidnapped. While they loved me, they were also children who didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. As they grew older, the absence of their little sister became a distant memory, a story told in family whispers and occasional moments of grief. Sarah's arrival gave them something tangible to hold onto. She was there to fill the space I had left behind, becoming their sister in every way that mattered during my absence. They played together, grew up together, and she became the sibling they could rely on. By the time I came back, they had already spent years with Sarah, forming bonds that I had missed out on when I returned. Those bonds didn't disappear overnight. Jack and Sam saw me as a stranger, someone who had disrupted the balance of their lives. And while they were glad I was back, I wasn't the sister they had known for the past several years. That was Sarah, and Sarah was perfect. Everyone adored her, except for me. I don't know when I first realized that Sarah hated me. Maybe it was in the little things at first, the way she looked at me when no one was watching, how her smile would disappear the second our parents left the room. But as the days turned into weeks, it became more obvious. Sarah was jealous, not of what I had, because I had nothing, but of what I could take away from her. She had spent years building her place in this family, becoming the perfect daughter. And now, with me back, I was a threat, even if I didn't realize it at the time. She started small, subtle things that my parents didn't notice. She'd forget to pass on messages to me or tell me the wrong time for family outings, making me look careless. She was clever, always playing the innocent, sweet girl in front of my parents. I, on the other hand, was still trying to find my footing in a world that no longer felt like mine. One evening, I overheard her talking to her friends on the phone. I stood just outside her bedroom door, the wood slightly cracked open. "Can you believe she's back?" Sarah whispered, her voice sharp. "I thought she was dead or something. I wish she had stayed wherever she was. Now my life is ruined. Everyone's going to find out I'm not their real daughter." She said the words with such venom, such hatred, that it stunned me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the familiar burn of tears behind my eyes. I should have burst into the room, confronted her, demanded an explanation. But I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, unable to move. I stood there, motionless, my back pressed against the cold wall outside Sarah's room. Her words echoed in my ears, each syllable dripping with venom. I wanted to storm in and confront her, to scream that I belonged here, that I was the real daughter. But I didn't. Instead, I backed away, slipping silently down the hallway to my room, her voice still ringing in my head. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of Sarah's hatred heavy on my chest. She had spent years building her place in this family, and my return had shaken her perfect world. But why did it feel like I was the intruder? Why was I the one left out? It didn't take long before Sarah's quiet jabs became more frequent, more deliberate. She would, accidentally, spill juice on my homework or conveniently forget to mention family events until it was too late for me to join. And then there were the subtle comments, always said with that innocent smile of hers, like when she'd say, "Oh Carol, I'm sure you're not used to this fancy stuff after where you've been." My parents never caught on, too busy showering Sarah with praise to notice the tension growing between us, but the worst part was how easily Sarah made herself look like the victim. I'd try to call her out on her behavior, but she always had a way of twisting things around, making it seem like I was the one overreacting, like I was the one with the problem. "Carol, why are you being so mean to Sarah?" my mother would ask, frowning at me over dinner. "She's been nothing but kind to you since you came back." I'd open my mouth to defend myself, to tell them what Sarah had been doing, but then I'd look at her, sitting there with her wide, innocent eyes, and I knew no one would believe me. Not when she was their perfect daughter. Not when I was the one who had been gone for so long, forgotten in the shadows. The more I tried to push back, the worse things got. It was as if Sarah had a sixth sense for knowing exactly when to strike. Every time I tried to expose her, she turned it around on me once. She purposely lost a necklace my mother had given me, a delicate gold chain I had been wearing the day I was taken. It was one of the few things I had left from my past, a symbol of the life I thought I would return to. When I asked Sarah about it, she denied even seeing it. "I'm sure you just misplaced it, Carol," she said with a saccharine smile, her eyes gleaming. "After all, you've been through a lot. It's understandable if your memory isn't what it used to be." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to scream, to tell my parents what she was doing, but I knew how it would look. The poor, damaged girl, just returned from years of hardship, accusing their precious Sarah of something so petty. It would only make me look worse, more unstable. So I kept quiet, swallowing the bitterness. It wasn't just that Sarah was easier to love because she was there, it was also because my parents felt guilty. Deep down, I think they knew they had failed me. They couldn't protect me from being kidnapped, and they couldn't bring me home sooner. In many ways, favoring Sarah was a way of avoiding that guilt. If they could make Sarah's life perfect, it would somehow make up for the imperfection of what had happened to me. Favoring Sarah was also a form of denial. Admitting that they had been wrong to let her take my place meant confronting the fact that they had failed me as parents. And that was too painful. So, they threw themselves into loving her, and in doing so, they justified pushing me aside when I came back. Sarah's manipulation wasn't limited to our home. At school, she played the role of the perfect daughter of the Smiths. No one knew her true origins, not until I returned. The truth about her adoption had been buried for years, a secret that Sarah and my parents kept well hidden. But with my arrival, the whispers started. People began to ask questions, wondering why I had suddenly appeared, why no one had ever mentioned me before. It didn't take long for the truth to slip out, and when it did, Sarah's carefully crafted world began to crack. Her classmates, the ones who had once worshipped her for being rich, beautiful, and smart, now saw her differently. They started calling her the fake princess, whispering behind her back. And Sarah hated me for it. She didn't show it in public, of course. To everyone else, she was still sweet, kind Sarah. But in private, the gloves were off. Every time we were alone, her mask slipped, and I saw the real Sarah, the one who would stop at nothing to destroy me. For a long time, I just took it. I let Sarah walk all over me, manipulating my family and making me look like the villain. But one night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling like I had so many nights before, something inside me shifted. I was tired of being the victim, tired of letting Sarah control the narrative. If she could play games, then so could I. The first step in turning the tables was subtle, just like her. I knew I couldn't come at her directly, that would only backfire. So I started small, planting seeds of doubt where I could. I began making little mistakes in front of our parents, things that could be easily blamed on Sarah. Like when I, accidentally, forgot to bring a form from school that she was supposed to give our mother. Or when I'd misplace things that Sarah had borrowed, knowing full well where they were but pretending otherwise. At first, Sarah didn't notice. She was too busy keeping up her perfect act. But as time went on, the cracks started to show. I made sure to be just innocent enough, just clueless enough, that my parents never suspected I was doing anything on purpose. They started to wonder why Sarah was so forgetful, why she seemed to be making more mistakes than usual. But the real turning point came when I overheard Sarah talking to one of her friends at school. She didn't know I was listening, hidden behind a row of lockers, as she ranted about how much she hated living with that orphan, and how my parents were idiots for not seeing through her act. "Honestly, I'm only sticking around for the money," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "Once I graduate, I'm out of here. The Smiths can keep their charity case. I'm done pretending." It was just an angry talk. I know Sarah wanted to stay with the Smiths forever. That was it. That was my moment. I recorded everything on my phone, making sure I had proof of what Sarah was really like. The next day, I played the recording for my parents during dinner. "I think you should hear this," I said, sliding my phone across the table to my father. He pressed play, and as Sarah's voice filled the room, I watched as my parents' faces transformed from confusion to disbelief to anger. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the truth of her words sank in. I didn't, she stammered, but it was too late. The damage was done. For the first time, my parents looked at Sarah the way they had been looking at me, like she was the intruder, the one who didn't belong. The shift had begun. My family was finally seeing Sarah for who she really was, and I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I wasn't done yet, though. This was just the beginning. Sarah's face went pale as my parents sat in stunned silence, listening to her voice on the recording. The vile, hateful words she had spoken about them, about me, about the life she had been handed, none of it could be taken back. For years, she had built this pristine image, but in just a few minutes, I had torn it apart. When the recording finally stopped, the silence was suffocating. My mother's hands shook as she slowly set the phone down on the table. She couldn't even look at Sarah. My father, on the other hand, stared at her like she was a stranger, a feeling I knew all too well. "Sarah," he began, his voice dangerously calm, "what is the meaning of this?" She stumbled over her words, her eyes darting between me and my parents, trying to come up with an excuse, a lie, anything to save herself. But for the first time, there was no way out. She had shown her true colors, and no amount of sweet smiles or innocent eyes could fix what she had done. I didn't mean it," she finally managed, her voice small and panicked. "I was upset. You don't understand." "No," my father interrupted, his tone sharp. "We understand perfectly." Sarah had always been good at manipulating people, weaving her web of lies so expertly that even I had been fooled at first. But now, the web was unraveling, and with it, so was she. My parents didn't yell, they weren't the type to raise their voices, but the disappointment and betrayal in their eyes spoke louder than any words could. After that night, everything changed. My parents started to distance themselves from Sarah, slowly but surely. It was subtle at first, less praise at the dinner table, fewer indulgences like the expensive clothes and gifts she had once received without question. They didn't speak to her with the same warmth anymore, and Sarah could feel the shift. It was as if the pedestal she had been standing on was crumbling beneath her feet. But I wasn't finished. I knew that if I wanted to truly take back my place in the family, I needed to show everyone, not just my parents, who Sarah really was. While my parents had been quick to shift their attention once Sarah's lies were exposed, my brothers, Jack and Sam, had taken a bit longer to fully grasp the extent of Sarah's deception. For years, they had been closer to her than they had ever been to me. She had been the sister they could rely on, the one who was always around, and I had been the one they barely knew. But when the truth about Sarah's manipulation came to light, it hit them hard. I remember the day it happened, the day my brothers finally realized who Sarah truly was. We were sitting at the dinner table, and for once, Sarah wasn't the center of attention. She sat quietly, not making eye contact with anyone. My father had just made a passing comment about her grades slipping, and my mother had followed it up with a question about her future plans, plans that Sarah clearly didn't have. Jack, who had always been protective of Sarah, suddenly turned to her with a frown. "What's going on with you, Sarah?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You've been acting weird for months." Sarah didn't answer. She just sat there, staring at her plate, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying. Sam, who was usually quieter, spoke up next. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice softer but no less serious. "Did you really lie to us? About everything?" There was a long pause before Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears, but there was no defiance left in them. "I didn't mean for it to get so bad," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't want to lose you. Any of you." Jack slammed his fist on the table, making all of us jump. "That's not good enough, Sarah," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You lied to us. You made us believe you were someone you weren't. You turned our family against each other." Sam looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and hurt. "How could you do that, Sarah? We trusted you." At school, the whispers about Sarah being adopted had already spread, but now, armed with the knowledge of what she had said about my family, I began to subtly stoke the fire. It wasn't difficult. High school was a breeding ground for rumors, and Sarah, with her perfect image, had always attracted attention. It only took a few well-placed comments to a few key people, Sarah's so-called friends, and the gossip spread like wildfire. "Did you hear what Sarah said about her family?" I'd say casually, as if it was just something I had overheard. "She called them idiots, said she was only staying for the money." I didn't have to push too hard. Sarah's friends were already jealous of her, resentful of how easily she seemed to have everything. They didn't need much convincing to turn on her. Soon enough, people were whispering behind her back, calling her a gold digger, a fraud. The same people who had once idolized her now looked at her with suspicion. Sarah tried to fight back, of course. She tried to act as if nothing was wrong, smiling brightly and pretending that the rumors weren't getting to her. But I could see the cracks forming. She was losing control, and it terrified her. At home, things were even worse. My parents had always been generous with Sarah, showering her with gifts and affection. But now, every time she asked for something, they hesitated. My mother, who once couldn't go a day without praising Sarah, became cold, distant. She started to question Sarah's every move, wondering aloud if they had been too lenient, too blind to her true nature. "I don't understand how we didn't see it," my mother said one afternoon, her voice heavy with regret. "We thought she was perfect. I stayed quiet, but inside, I felt a grim satisfaction. Sarah had taken my place for so many years, but now, things were shifting in my favor. My parents had started to lean on me more, asking my opinion on things, including me in conversations they once reserved for Sarah. Slowly, but surely, I was becoming their daughter again, the one they trusted, the one they cherished. Sarah, on the other hand, was being pushed further and further to the edge. She tried to get back into my parents' good graces, putting on her best act, helping around the house, studying harder than ever, volunteering for family events, but nothing seemed to work. My parents didn't trust her anymore, and neither did anyone else. The more isolated Sarah became, the more desperate she grew. At school, she was no longer the queen bee she had once been. Her friends had abandoned her, and the popular crowd wanted nothing to do with her. They saw her as a fraud, a girl who had pretended to be something she wasn't for years. The fake princess, they called her behind her back. And that was when I decided to deliver the final blow. One afternoon, I found her in the school bathroom, crying quietly in one of the stalls. She hadn't seen me come in, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching her through the crack in the door. Part of me felt a flicker of guilt. This was the girl who had made my life hell, but seeing her so vulnerable, so broken, stirred something in me. But I pushed the feeling aside. This was what she deserved. She had taken everything from me, and now it was my turn. I cleared my throat, and Sarah's head snapped up. Her eyes were red and puffy, her mascara smudged from the tears. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and fear. "What do you want, Carol?" she asked, her voice shaky. I smiled, stepping closer. "I just wanted to check on you. It must be hard, you know, losing everything." She glared at me, wiping her eyes angrily. "You did this," she hissed. "You ruined my life." I shrugged, leaning casually against the sink. "Maybe, but you started it, Sarah. You thought you could take my place, but you were wrong. This was never your family. It was mine." Sarah clenched her fists, but she didn't say anything. She couldn't. She had lost, and we both knew it. It wasn't long before my parents made the final decision to cut ties with Sarah. She still lived with us, technically, but the bond had been severed. They no longer saw her as their daughter, no longer trusted her the way they once had. My mother, who had once doted on her endlessly, barely spoke to her. My father, always the calm, rational one, had distanced himself completely. At school, Sarah was nothing. She had no friends, no allies. The popular crowd had replaced her with someone new, and even the teachers who had once praised her began to see through her facade. She had become a ghost, drifting through the hallways unnoticed, unimportant. And me, I had reclaimed my place. My parents doted on me now, asking about my day, celebrating my achievements, small as they were. My brothers, Sam and Jack, had warmed up to me as well, finally treating me like the sister I had once been. As for Sarah, well, she had gotten what she deserved. The fake princess had fallen, and I had taken my rightful place as the true daughter of the Smith family. The weeks that followed Sarah's downfall were like a dream that I had spent months hoping it would come true. The shift in the household was subtle at first, but it grew more pronounced with each passing day. My parents began to look at me with a kind of admiration I had longed for since I returned. They began to treat me not just as their daughter, but as the only daughter that mattered. Meals became quieter. Sarah, who had once been the center of attention, was now an afterthought. She would sit silently at the table, her eyes downcast, while my parents asked about my day, my schoolwork, my plans for the future. Every now and then, I'd catch her glancing up at me, but the fire that had once burned in her eyes was gone. She looked hollow, like a shadow of the girl who had once ruled this house. I could have been gracious in victory, I suppose. I could have reached out to her, tried to extend an olive branch. But I didn't. After everything she had done to me, every lie, every manipulation, I felt no sympathy. Sarah had chosen this path, and now she was reaping what she had sown. It didn't take long for the effects of Sarah's fall from grace to fully manifest. At home, my parents treated her with a kind of cold indifference, almost as if she wasn't there. They no longer bought her new clothes or gave her spending money. My mother had even forgetting her birthday, a day that had once been filled with extravagant parties and gifts. It took time, but eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. As Sarah's lies and manipulations unraveled, my parents began to see the cracks in the perfect image they had built around her. They couldn't deny what was right in front of them anymore. The daughter they had placed on a pedestal wasn't who they thought she was. And as Sarah's true nature came to light, so did their guilt. Slowly, my parents began to realize how much they had neglected me, how much they had allowed Sarah to overshadow the daughter they had lost and regained. It wasn't an easy shift for them, but once the illusion shattered, there was no going back. At school, it was even worse. The rumors had spread like wildfire, and no one wanted to be associated with her anymore. She walked the halls alone, her head down, trying to avoid the whispers and snickers that followed her wherever she went. The popular crowd, the one she had been so desperate to be part of, had turned their backs on her completely. They had moved on to someone new, someone shinier. One day, I saw her sitting by herself at lunch, picking at her food, her eyes distant. She looked so small, so defeated. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the way she had tried to destroy me, the way she had manipulated my parents, my brothers, my entire life. This was her punishment, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook. As Sarah's life crumbled, mine flourished. My parents were constantly asking about my schoolwork, about my future plans, about anything I wanted or needed. They took me shopping, bought me new clothes, and even began talking about sending me to an elite private school, something that had once been reserved only for Sarah. My mother, who had always been so distant after my return, now treated me like the daughter she had always wanted. She would take me out for lunch, just the two of us, something she used to do with Sarah. We'd talk about my future, my dreams, and for the first time, I felt like I was part of this family again. Even my brothers, Sam and Jack, had warmed up to me. They started inviting me to hang out with them, something that had been unthinkable before. Sam, who had once barely spoken to me, now asked about my day and offered to help me with my homework. Jack, who had been just as distant, started including me in his plans, asking if I wanted to join him and his friends for outings. It felt good, like I had finally found my place. After that confrontation, Jack and Sam's attitudes toward Sarah changed completely. They didn't speak to her unless they had to, and when they did, their words were short and cold. Gone was the brotherly affection they had once shown her, replaced instead with anger and betrayal. They had been duped, and they hated her for it. Jack, always the more vocal of the two, was especially harsh. He couldn't stand the sight of her anymore. He would snap at her whenever she tried to speak, reminding her of every lie she had told, every manipulation she had tried to pull. It was almost as if he needed to punish her for what she had done, not just to me, but to him and Sam as well. Sam, on the other hand, was quieter in his anger. He didn't lash out the way Jack did, but his coldness was just as painful. He ignored Sarah completely, acting as if she no longer existed. Whenever she tried to speak to him, he would just walk away, leaving her standing there in silence. It was strange, watching my brothers, who had once treated Sarah like a real sister, suddenly turn their backs on her. But it was also satisfying. They had finally seen what I had known all along, that Sarah was a fraud. And now, they wanted nothing to do with her. As Sarah's relationships with Jack and Sam deteriorated, mine with them grew stronger. It was almost as if, with Sarah out of the picture, there was finally room for me in their lives. Jack, who had once barely acknowledged my existence, started inviting me to hang out with him and his friends. We would go out on weekends, grab food together, talk about school, and laugh in a way we never had before. Sam was more reserved, but even he began to show me a warmth I hadn't expected. He would offer to help me with my homework, ask about my day, and include me in family discussions. It felt good. For the first time, I was their sister, not just the girl who had come back after years of being missing, but a real part of the family. One evening, as we sat around the kitchen table, just the three of us, Jack turned to me with a grin. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you're a lot cooler than I gave you credit for." I laughed, a genuine laugh that felt like it had been a long time coming. "Thanks, I guess," Sam smiled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, we should have hung out more before. But I'm glad we're doing it now." There was no bitterness in his words, no regret, just a simple acknowledgement that we had all been given a second chance. And this time, we weren't going to waste it. As my bond with Jack and Sam grew, Sarah's isolation deepened. She had no one left in the family who cared about her. My parents had turned their attention to me, and my brothers wanted nothing to do with her. But there was still a part of me that couldn't fully relax. As much as I had taken back my role in the family, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like this victory wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. Yes, I had won. Yes, Sarah had been dethroned. But watching her struggle, watching her fall apart, didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. As time went on, Sarah's isolation became more severe. She stopped trying to engage with my parents altogether. They had made it clear that they no longer trusted her, and Sarah, in her own prideful way, stopped seeking their approval. She retreated into herself, spending more and more time in her room, avoiding family dinners and outings. At school, her grades began to slip. She had always been the top student, the one who got straight A's and won awards. But now, even that was slipping away. I heard whispers that she had been caught cheating on an exam, something that would have been unthinkable for the Sarah I used to know. One evening, I found her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. She didn't even notice me come in for a moment. I just stood there, watching her. She looked so defeated. Her once perfect hair was now tangled, her clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't the confident, manipulative girl I had once feared. She was broken. I approached her, and for the first time in months, we were alone. No parents, no audience, just the two of us. "You look terrible," I said, my voice lacking the malice I had once felt toward her. She didn't even flinch. "I don't care anymore," she whispered, her voice hollow. "What's the point? No one cares about me, not you. Not them, no one." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her that this was what she deserved, that she had brought this on herself. But another part of me, a small, quiet part, felt something else. Pity, sympathy, I wasn't sure. "You could have been part of this family," Sarah, I said quietly. But you chose to make it a competition. You tried to push me out. What did you think would happen? She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, she whispered. I didn't want to lose them. I didn't want to lose what I had. For a moment, I saw the girl underneath, the girl who had been taken in by my parents, who had been given a life she didn't want to lose. She wasn't evil, she was just scared. But it was too late for that now. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic in the house shifted completely. Sarah was no longer the beloved daughter, no longer the golden child. My parents had grown distant from her, focusing all their attention on me. Sarah was just there, like a shadow in the background, unnoticed and unwanted. At school, the bullying had gotten worse. People who once adored her now went out of their way to make her life miserable. They would knock her books out of her hands, spread rumors about her, laugh at her in the hallways. And Sarah, who had once been so confident, so untouchable, did nothing to stop them. She just took it, shrinking further and further into herself. I could have stopped it. I could have said something, done something to make it better for her. But I didn't. I had fought too hard to reclaim my place in this family, and I wasn't about to jeopardize it now. But as I watched Sarah disappear into the background, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really what I wanted? Was this really the victory I had been fighting for all these years? With Sarah fading into the background, life became exactly what I had hoped it would be. My parents had fully embraced me as their only daughter, doting on me, showering me with the love and attention I had once been so starved for. It was strange, after all those years of feeling like an outsider in my own home, to now be the center of everything. My mother and father began planning for my future, talking about sending me to the best universities, taking me on trips, and making up for the years we had lost. At school, things were just as good. Without Sarah, there was no longer anyone standing in my way. I wasn't trying to be popular, but somehow, that's exactly what happened. People started gravitating toward me, curious about the girl who had quietly reclaimed her place, the one who had exposed the fake princess. I found myself surrounded by friends, invitations to parties, and a level of respect I had never experienced before. And honestly, I thrived. I had spent so many years in the shadows, always overshadowed by Sarah, that now, with her gone, I finally felt free. Free to be myself. Free to enjoy life. Free to feel like I belonged. As I moved forward, Sarah's life continued to spiral downward. She became a ghost, both at home and at school. My parents barely acknowledged her existence. They didn't speak to her unless it was necessary, and even then, their words were short and clipped, filled with disappointment. It was as if they were waiting for her to leave, waiting for her to vanish from their lives entirely. At school, the bullying intensified. People who had once idolized her now went out of their way to make her life miserable. I overheard stories of how students would mock her in class, push her in the hallways, spread rumors about her past and how she had tricked my family. Sarah, who had once been so poised and put together, was now a wreck. Her grades plummeted, her appearance grew disheveled, and her reputation was beyond saving. She had no one, no friends, no allies, no family. The fake princess had been exposed, and no one wanted anything to do with her. One afternoon, I saw her sitting outside the school alone, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the ground. She didn't even notice me walk by for a fleeting second. I felt something stir inside me, a moment of pity, perhaps, but I quickly pushed it away. Sarah had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. This was the life she deserved. With Sarah's fall came my rise. My parents, having finally seen me for who I truly was, were determined to make up for the years we had lost. We went on family vacations together, just the three of us. My mother and I spent hours shopping, bonding over the things we had missed out on while I was gone. My father, who had always been more reserved, started to show a softer side, asking about my future, encouraging me to follow my dreams. My brothers, Sam and Jack, had also warmed to me in a way I never thought possible. We started spending more time together, playing games, watching movies, even going on family outings as a group. The tension that had once defined our relationships was gone, replaced with a sense of camaraderie I had never expected. At school, I was doing better than ever. My grades improved, my social circle expanded, and for the first time, I felt like I was in control of my life. No more looking over my shoulder, no more wondering when Sarah would strike. She was out of the picture now, and I had reclaimed what was mine. I had won. As for Sarah, things only got worse. My parents quietly began making plans for her to leave after high school. There was no discussion about sending her to college. No talk of supporting her beyond the bare minimum. She had become an afterthought, a burden my parents were eager to rid themselves of. Sarah tried to fight it, of course. She would attempt to engage with my parents, pleading for their attention, but it was no use. They had made up their minds. Sarah's time in our family was coming to an end, and she knew it. I heard rumors that she had tried to get a part-time job, only to be turned away. No one wanted to hire the girl whose reputation was in shambles. At school, she continued to be an outcast, barely acknowledged by anyone, constantly reminded of the life she had lost. One day, not long before graduation, I overheard her talking to a teacher, asking for help with her college applications. The teacher's response was blunt. Without her once stellar grades, Sarah's chances were slim. She would have to settle for something far less prestigious than what she had once dreamed of. I didn't feel bad, not anymore. This was the fate she had earned, the fate she had crafted with her lies and deceit. She had taken everything from me, and now, she was paying the price. Graduation came and went, and with it, Sarah's final departure from our lives. My parents didn't throw her a party, didn't celebrate her achievements, there was nothing to celebrate. By the time graduation rolled around, Sarah was a ghost in our house. My parents had already made it clear that she wasn't welcome to stay after high school, and my brothers had stopped even acknowledging her existence. She was alone, abandoned by the family she had once tried so hard to claim as her own. When the day finally came for her to leave, there was no fanfare, no tears, no goodbyes. My parents told her that they will disown her, they will not let her take their last name. Tears kept falling from her eyes as she packed her things quietly, and without a word, she walked the door. My parents didn't even look up from what they were doing. Jack and Sam didn't bother to see her off. It was as if she had never been part of our family at all. And in that moment, I realized something. I didn't feel anything. No joy, no satisfaction, no guilt. Sarah had been a part of my life for so long, a thorn in my side, that I had thought I would feel something when she was finally gone. But I didn't. I had moved on. Sarah left quietly, without fanfare, moving away to start a new life somewhere far from us. My parents didn't speak of her again. It was as if she had never existed. As for me, my life only continued to improve. I was accepted into a prestigious university, thanks to my hard work and the support of my family. My future was bright, filled with endless possibilities. The dark years of Sarah's reign over our family were behind me, and I had emerged stronger for it. Looking back, I knew I had made the right choices. Sarah had brought this on herself, and in the end, she had reaped what she had sown. I had won, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly happy.